My name is Pemi and I'm supporting Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our winter learning program. And this offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics you have told us are of interest to you today. Today's event is on the subject matter of manual for streets. This winter learning program is brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. And this slide summarizes who we are and what we do. We've launched the Centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government, and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities most need support and how this can be best delivered. We look forward to hearing how we did in the survey poll at the end of the session. Next slide, please. On the screen, you see a breakdown of the session today. After the introduction, I'll be handing over to John, who will be setting the scene, and he will hand over to Robert, who will speak on integrated planning and vision-led development. Robert will hand over to Sarah, who will talk on the importance of manual for streets in national planning policy. Sarah will hand over to Sally, who will talk on the principles of placemaking and details of street design. Robert will come back to tell us on the final thoughts and conclusions of manual for streets, and we'll finish with a Q&A session. And I'll be drawing the session to a close with a further poll to get some immediate feedback on the session. I'll be handing over to John now. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. And just to say, I'm John Sanford from the Master Development and Design team of Homes England. We're a small team responsible for promoting design quality across the projects that we, Homes England, are seeking to deliver. Quickly scene setting, the landscape of transport planning is evolving, and Manual for Streets 3 is an anticipated document that will bring together some of the changes that we are seeing in the way transport planning is undertaken. And this event is basically to brief you around that document and its contents and the thrust of it. Next slide, please. From Homes England point of view, there is a golden thread that goes through not only this, but some of the other events that we've already seen delivered to you. So in terms of active travel, the 20-minute neighbourhood event, an event that we staged about the local transport planning process and decarbonisation of transport, and now this one on Manual for Streets 3. And that golden thread really is about delivering sustainable, self-contained, but importantly, deliverable places. And doing that also relates to the emerging vision and validate or vision-led approach to transport planning, as opposed to the traditional decide and provide, predict and provide approach. And that vision-led approach has a number of themes that go through it. Creating self-contained, sustainable places where people can live and work locally, arguably. Placing an emphasis on the investment in sustainable and active travel movement interventions. An emphasis on underpinning behavioural change in the way new places are used, with a greater emphasis in placemaking infrastructure that will enhance value and site deliverability. Enabling a move away from highways-based solutions to enable development of new places to be delivered. And shifting the focus away from minimising congestion effects for car drivers, more towards an emphasis on overall accessibility throughout the day by all modes of travel. Accepting that the inherent capacity of the road network effectively limits demand, and maybe trying to move away from always trying to sort of chase the goal of trying to increase capacity to meet with projected exacerbation of traffic levels. So I'm trying to move away from that. And in so doing, trying to enabling a lower financial cost in highways and enable lower CO2 outcomes and costs in the site construction and in the life of development. So those things are things that we see as being things that run through this vision-led approach that we will find out more about today. And also we see Homes England, the triple access planning model, as being a very useful way of grouping interventions in transport around in delivering housing and new community projects. This is a model that was produced, has been written by Glenn Lyons and colleagues at the University of the West of England. We think it's very useful because it helps us to see transport planning as being for sites as involving transport infrastructure investments as being one foundation of what you can do to make sites happen. Importantly, also married to that, spatial planning interventions. So it's not just about transport, it's about making sure that the spatial planning as well is linked to that. And finally, making sure places are really well digitally connected. So delivering smart places that are fit for the way people live and work in the future, in today and in the future. So having set out that golden thread, I'd like to hand over now to Rob Singleton from the DFT for the next slides. Thank you.
Hiya, hopefully you can all see and hear me. Good morning. I'm Rob Singleton. I'm the Head of Planning at the Department for Transport. I'm here to talk to you a little bit, well, for about 5 minutes or so, just about what we at DFT are doing in this sort of design-led space, but also what we're doing more generally in terms of trying to embed more of a vision-led approach and sort of promote sustainable transport modes as the first choice for journeys. So I'll just take you through that. So next slide, please. So first thing I want to say is I'm the Head of Planning, but I form part of a wider planning division within DFT. We recently restructured ourselves so that we could better engage with the planning systems, both the transport planning system and the spatial planning system, to ultimately try and not only provide a degree of coordinated guiding mind type expertise within the department, because the department itself relies on the planning systems to get consent for a lot of its projects, but also to drive through some more clearer objectives around what we want to achieve with transport, particularly as a catalyst for growth, a catalyst for sustainable growth, and how we can do things differently in terms of addressing climate change and the need to decarbonise our transport network. So we created a planning division probably about a year ago, there or thereabouts, and the objective of the strategic planning team, which is my part of the team in that, is creating a centre of excellence. So we kind of act as consultants. I'm a town planner by profession, have been for years, and my colleagues are as well. And we work across all modes, and we provide expert advice on how you address and engage with the planning system in England. We also have a very clear mandate to help decarbonise our transport network. As you guys are probably aware, Transport Decarbonisation Plan was published, I'm going to say about 2 years ago now. It had a very clear aspiration and commitment within it around vision-led planning and the need to decarbonise our transport network through the spatial planning system. But also I think key to all of that, the thing that really underpins it, is how we deliver sustainable patterns of development that are really and truly infrastructure-led. And that's a critical question. It's not a new idea, but it's really important that we have a transport system that really drives sustainable growth, puts people where they need to be, is appropriately supported by the right infrastructure delivered in the right place and at the right time, and gives people genuine modal choice. We have very clear objectives, not least through Active Travel England, to make walking and cycling the natural first choice for journeys for the majority of our trips in cities and towns. And that that's a lofty commitment, but it's an appropriate one, because ensuring that we have genuine modal choice and ensuring we're locating development in the right places and it's served by the right infrastructure is critical in achieving our decarbonisation goals. Next slide, please. Part of the reason for us to be is, and again, this isn't rocket science, this is not a new idea, but for years, transport planning and spatial planning have been kind of siloed. Sometimes they don't talk to each other. Some people do it better than others. But ultimately, we do genuinely need to better align these two planning systems so they truly speak to each other. So when we're planning for growth, we're planning for transport, and that growth is infrastructure-led rather than being led just by land availability. Our priorities are to improve that connectivity across the UK, but also across our communities and the accessibility of our communities. And like I say, give that genuine modal choice for journeys. That's really critical in terms of how people move, how they interact and stuff like that. But underpinning all of that, I feel, is the importance of good design and good quality design, and ensuring that people have a street and built environment that they can interact with, feel safe in. This is beautiful, but also is promoting healthy activity, is a place for nature to thrive and for people to socialise and coalesce. So what we want to do is achieve this by shifting towards more sustainable transport networks, like I say, offering genuine choice, adopting a vision-led approach. So think about the outcomes that we want to achieve and what our communities want to achieve, which is the critical point here, and make sure that we're delivering the outcomes that they need to meet their needs, both now and in the future. Linked onto that is that we need to secure those better outcomes for our communities, the people that use the space. Good design and planning, as I say, is critical to that. We as a team and as a department collaborate very closely with colleagues over at DLUX, Sarah being one, and all of our other key stakeholders like the Chartered Institution for Highways and Transportation, the Transport Planning Society, and the Royal Town Planning Institute. Shouldn't have got that wrong, being a town planner. And also, how do we better join up across boundaries so that we do have a real strategic vision of stuff? So I think some of the keys to realising these ambitions are first and foremost strong leadership. Now, I don't think that's strong leadership just from government. I think that's leadership at local level, at community level, to realise these aspirations and these ambitions. I think we need a long-term collective effort. I think we have to support innovation. The way we travel has markedly changed in just the last few years. As I say, vision-led planning is incredibly important in moving forward, offering that genuine choice, making those behavioural changes, and ensuring that that's embedded in plan making and decision taking. And really importantly, and I think that sometimes the bit that we struggle with sometimes the most is that while it is common sense to us that transport can derive wonderful outcomes for our communities, and sustainable transport particularly can derive that sort of benefit, communicating that to others is actually sometimes quite difficult, and getting decision takers to take the need for sustainable transport and infrastructure delivery seriously has always been a bit of a challenge. Next slide, please. So I think critically, we're at a really good place in policy terms at the present moment in time. We have lots of opportunities to make things better, to do things differently. And I think, not to focus too much on this one, because DFT are doing a lot of really great things, including local transport plan guidance, Man Off the Streets Free, which will be coming soon or in due course. But ultimately, I think the reforms to the English planning system is incredibly important in fostering that step change, or the change that we need to realise. And that means planning for new development around existing transport hubs and the places that are the most accessible or can be made most accessible by timely and well-planned transport interventions. All developments, there's no excuse for any development not to have easy and safe access to a good quality walking and cycling network, because I walk for the vast majority of my journeys, but that's because I have the option to. So given that genuine choice is really important, but also, like I say, that that bit about it being infrastructure-led is critical. Infrastructure can unlock sustainable growth, but it can also better our existing settlements, our existing communities. It can revitalise our town centres, and it can revitalise our cities and towns and villages up and down the country. Next slide, please. But above all else, and the purpose of this, is that good design really matters. In order to achieve a lot of the aims that I've set out before, design is kind of right in the heart of it. And that's about how we interact with our built environment, how it makes us feel, how we are encouraged and enabled and empowered to sort of spend time outside. And in the, what is it, 2/3 of the built environment is actually the roads and streets, not the actual buildings themselves. So that's a really important part. It's the glue that brings our communities together. So why are we forgetting about streets and good design within streets? Well, we shouldn't be. I don't think we are, but I think we've got more to do. And I think coupled with, you know, the National Model Design Code, National Design Guidance, and the soon to come Manual for Streets 3, I think we have a chance to make a real difference on the ground. And on that, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who will take you through Deluxe Design.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you for inviting me to this session. I'm Sarah Allen. I'm Head of Architecture at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and I lead the design and placemaking team that sits within the Planning Directorate. Next slide, please. We're going to run a poll now, just to understand how often you use Manual for Streets, and 1 being least often and 5 being the most often. So please, let's see. Oh goodness. So it's looking as if actually Manual for Streets, that current Manual for Streets is not used by nearly 60% of people on this call, and only by 2% used often. So that's good. That makes my presentation very important and relevant, and the rest of the presentations that you're hearing from us today. So next slide, please. Designing for people is fundamental if we are to achieve the environmental, social and economic objectives of national planning policy. To design places that reduce air pollution, to create places that support physical activity and ensure places are designed to adapt to the impacts of climate change require us to change how we think about the way we design our streets and public spaces. We need to put designing spaces for people to be together, to transact, to be convivial, to exercise, to be quiet, at the heart of our policies and practice. Next slide, please. The consequences of not designing with people in mind, but instead prioritizing car-dominated environments, are still happening far too often and have detrimental impacts on our built environment and on people. A housing audit of 142 schemes carried out by Place Alliance in 2019 concluded that the least successful design elements nationally relate to overly engineered highways infrastructure and the poor integration of storage bins and car parking. These problems led to unattractive and unfriendly environments dominated by large areas of hard surfaces, tarmac or brick pavers in particular, parked cars and bins. Car-dominated environments in residential neighbourhoods do not encourage or even allow, in some cases, physical exercise outside the immediate demise of the home. Next slide. The 2019 Place Alliance housing audit tells us that audited design outcomes scored progressively more poorly as projects moved away from the urban core and reduced in density, and if they were built on greenfield sites rather than brownfield sites. A report published by Transport for New Homes in early 2022 called Building Car Dependency similarly found, after looking at 20 different new developments on green and brownfield sites, that most greenfield development was designed to prioritize car use, and that residents would have to make most local journeys by car. Greenfield sites were located on sites that relied on cars, and existing residents in nearby towns noticed more traffic as a result of such developments. The housing audit also demonstrated that unfairness is being built into developments in poorer communities. In every region where there were better designed schemes, they achieved higher sales values. Poorly designed schemes achieved lower values. The audit suggests there is a continued trend by a factor of 10 towards delivering substandard design outcomes for less affluent communities. Next slide. National planning policy and design guidance clearly sets out expectations about the importance of creating beautiful and well-designed places. Next slide. These next few slides will focus on what government policies and guidance are doing to support people-centred design. The National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, sets the direction of travel. It emphasises that decisions should aim to achieve places which promote social interaction, including opportunities for incidental meetings between people. It highlights the importance of mixed-use development, strong neighbourhood centres, street layouts that allow for easy pedestrian and cycle connections within and between neighbourhoods. The NPPF encourages consideration of opportunities to promote walking, cycling and public transport use, and that patterns of movement, streets, parking and other transport considerations are integral to the design of schemes and contribute to making high-quality places. It says significant development should be focused on locations which are or can be more sustainable through limiting the need to travel and offering a genuine choice of transport modes. It states that planning policies should support an appropriate mix of uses across an area and within larger scale sites to minimise the number and length of journeys needed for employment, shopping, leisure, education and other activities. Next slide, please. Chapter 12 of the NPPF focuses on achieving well-designed places. It emphasises the need to provide maximum clarity about design expectations at an early stage, highlighting that all local planning authorities should prepare design guides or codes consistent with the principles set out in the National Design Guide and National Model Design Code, and which reflect local character and design preferences. Planning policies and decisions should ensure that developments establish or maintain a strong sense of place, using the arrangement of street spaces, building types and materials to create attractive, welcoming and distinctive places to live, work and visit. The NPPF recognises that trees make an important contribution to the character and quality of urban environments and can also help adapt to climate change. It states that new development should be planned for in ways that avoid increased vulnerability to the range of impacts arising from climate change and can help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such as through its location, orientation and design. Highlighting that major developments should incorporate sustainable drainage systems unless there is clear evidence that this would be inappropriate. Next slide. The National Design Guide sets clear principles for better movement in public spaces. It simply states that a well-designed place is accessible and easy to move around, and that public space should feel safe, social, and inclusive. It breaks down what a well-designed movement network should provide, including limiting the impacts of car use, supporting green infrastructure, in particular street trees. And similarly, a well-designed public space should have a hierarchy of spaces, be safe, secure, and attractive for all. Other key principles affecting street design are context, identity, nature, and lifespan. Next slide, please. The National Model Design Code goes further. It sets model design parameters that can be coded for movement and public space considerations, such as creating a connected network for all modes of transport, promoting active travel, and ensuring parking is well considered. It sets out common street types and functions and how these can be designed as part of a local design code. Manual for Streets considers these street types in relation to a range of users and detailed design considerations. It is vital that highways engineers, planning authorities and design teams understand and use these documents to ensure clear principles and practical guidelines influence the quality of projects being built. The NPPF states that local authorities should not be granting planning permission for schemes that fail to demonstrate that they meet national and local policies and guidance. Next slide, please. Here are 3 core principles flowing through from the MPPF to the National Design Guide and the National Model Design Code that should be underpinning the work we all need to do to reduce air pollution, increase opportunities for physical activity, and tackling the impacts of climate change. We should be encouraging multiple means of travel, creating connectedness, thinking about how well we use what we have. Next slide. Encouraging multiple means of travel means supporting walking, cycling, and public transport, as well as supporting more sustainable means of travel, such as electric vehicles and electric cycles. This can contribute to reductions in air pollution. For this to happen, we need to create multifunctional streets, being clear about their use and design principles. To be multifunctional, streets should be well lit and feel safe. Studies should be carried out using different tools to understand how easy it is to access different modes of transport. PTAL plans, mapping walking distances, looking at how ease of permeability can be reduced for vehicular transport. Next slide. On creating connectedness, a connected street network provides a variety of choices of streets for moving around a place, allowing people to make efficient journeys and making walking and cycling more attractive, increasing physical activity. Prioritizing connectedness can influence how we think about public space and how people will use it. Coding for a sense of enclosure around public spaces that can act as nodes for meeting, for example, can help to create a more appealing and popular space. This means looking at how buildings might frame the space and how tall buildings are, thinking about the scale of the enclosed space and what uses might be provided within the space and the surrounding buildings. Understanding whether local traffic can use some of the space and how spaces are serviced are also important. Next slide, please. And last of all, but perhaps most important, thinking about how well we use what we have. The MPPF encourages new development to be focused on locations which can be more sustainable. This means that local planning authorities should be thinking about how intensifying existing places, creating more complex development, for example, can help to sustain a mix of uses and support a diverse range of needs. This approach should also then consider how these places can be more pleasant to live, creating spaces for trees and using nature to manage water. Increasing rainfall and pressures on our water supply mean that sustainable urban drainage solutions should be a first resort, not something value engineered out of projects. Trees, when considered as a whole in urban areas, using urban forest strategies, for example, can help to provide shade and absorb CO2 as well as other air pollutants. They can help with water management and provide benefits to health and biodiversity. Wherever possible, we should be substituting hard landscape for opportunities for green and blue infrastructure. Next slide. And in order to achieve this change in thinking and action towards people-centered design, we must engage communities and work together with users, design professionals, developers, and funders. Engagement builds trust and understanding, allows people to raise their concerns, provides the opportunities for winning over hearts and minds and setting local visions and design standards that will ensure we're designing streets that will sustain human interaction and allow urban life to flourish for several more centuries. Last slide, please. So it's just vital that we remember why this all matters. So I'll leave you with this quote from Robert Adams, who's the Director of City Design at City of Melbourne. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over now to Sally Gibbons.
Hello, everyone. Right, there we go. Yeah, morning, everyone. It's nice to be here and thanks for having me. To introduce myself, I'm Sally Gibbons. I'm the head of the Traffic Science and Street Design Policy Department for Transport. My background is as a traffic engineer, but I've been involved in traffic management, traffic engineering, traffic management policy at the department for a long time now. And my team is responsible for the delivery of the updates manual for streets, working very closely with Rob and Sarah on that. Next slide, please. So I just want to sort of talk a little bit about what streets are, what the sort of the history of manual for streets, what it says at the moment, then go a little bit into the project to update it and where that is and what's going on with that. And really just build on what Rob and Sarah both said. And, you know, the importance of streets, it's the space between the buildings, it's 3/4 of public space. So how it is designed and used is a significant impact on people's lives. Every journey pretty much involves using the street in some way, even if all you're doing is walking to where you park the car. They're the glue that enable access to all other modes of transport. So it's incredibly important how they are designed and maintained and operated and managed and so on. Next slide, please. Thank you. Bit of background on who does what, just to sort of be clear about what we're talking about. We're concerned really with all the roads managed locally, which is 98% of the road network by length in England. National highways manage the motorways and trunk roads. When we're talking about streets, we're not talking about the SRN, we're talking about local roads managed on a local level by highway authorities. Really, that's always been the case. The right-hand image there is the 1835 Highway Act, which is the first thing that codified who was responsible for what in managing streets. And local authorities, as many of you will know, have a wide range of powers, duties, responsibilities, and how they design, operate, and manage the roads on their network. And they have day-to-day autonomy in how they do that. Historically, it's never been a centrally managed thing, which is one of the tensions that we face in how we get streets, you know, well designed, and how we sort of embody the principles of MFS in practice. The role of the department and government generally is to sort of set the policy framework, to set the funding framework and the legislative framework, and encourage through good practice. Next slide, please. So within that framework, what's the manual for streets? Just sort of drilling down a little more into some of the detail. You probably all, many of you will know this, but I think it's useful background. It's our National Street Design Technical Guidance. It was the original manual for streets, published in 2007, followed in 2010 by Manual for Streets 2. MFS was superseded Design Bulletin 32 and Places, Streets and Movements, and was focused on residential and quiet streets. Manual for Streets 2 took those principles and extended them out to busier streets, high streets and town centres. So it didn't supersede MFS, the two are complementary. It completely changed the approach to design and provision of residential and other streets. It sort of was trying to turn on its head this very car-centric planning, transport planning, traffic engineering that we'd had for really most of the 20th century, by putting people first, or including advice on how to design streets for people. It's got two main audiences. It is very much on the planning and new development side, but also it's very much applicable to highways and existing streets, and all of those, the street layouts that have been there for hundreds, thousands of years. Streets, the buildings come and go, but the streets stay there. So, Manual for Streets principles are very much, the document is very much applicable to those streets as well. And it's for everyone involved in street design, as I'll go into. Next slide, please. Who is it for? Yeah, anyone that's involved in street design: architects, developers, urban designers, local authority, highway engineers, planners. It's multidisciplinary. It can be used in all stages in scheme development, right from the sort of concept master planning all the way to how you maintain and manage. It sits within this ecosystem of the planning guidance, other guidance, which Sarah's alluded to already. So it needs to be sort of situated within that. But also, from a highways point of view particularly, it should inform the local design guidance, because local highway authorities are responsible for setting their design standards. We want them to be picking up manual for streets and adopting that, obviously. That's happened to, not the extent that we would like. But it is very much what the government considers to be good practice in designing streets. The updated version will be used also by Active Travel England as part of their role in assessing active travel schemes alongside Local Transport Note 120. It's the original manual applied to England and Wales. It's likely that the update will apply to England. We're still having a few conversations, but it is primarily an English document. Next slide, please. Thank you. and it covers, as I say, the whole sort of remit of street design. It's a slightly jokey headline there, but I showed this slide at a PINS annual training event a few years ago, sort of making the point that it's not just about picking up the visibility pages and assessing whether or not the junctions meet that, and that's whether that's compliance with MFS. It's much broader than that. It's putting residential streets at the heart of sustainable communities, and it's this idea of no longer designing streets so that place is subservient automatically to movement. Next slide, please. It touches on a huge range of different policy areas, as both Rob and Sarah have alluded to. From the department's point of view, I mean, a lot of objectives around obviously active travel with gear change and the targets around short journeys being walked or cycled, the transport decarbonisation plan, rollout of EV charging, how you accommodate those things within the streets, future of mobility, where are we going with things like micromobility? Again, that's something that needs to be accommodated within the street. And accessibility and inclusion, how streets can be accessible and available to everybody is a big focus for us as well at the moment, and all sorts of other public health objectives, street trees. It touches on how you can help deliver all of these things. Next slide, please. Thank you. We've seen this already in Sarah's presentation. It links very closely, obviously, to the National Design Guide. And we work with the team producing a national model design code to ensure those links were there. There's these four characteristics picked out there. That's what the design guide says about them. Built form, movement, public space, identity, probably the four most relevant to streets. Next slide, please. So that, yes, the previous slide was how it was the sort of the key characteristics from the National Design Guide that are relevant to streets. This is how the manual for streets, the existing manual, refers to them. So you can see, I'm not going to read them, but you can see that the pick out, they mesh very closely with what the design guide says. Next slide, please. So how can the manual for streets, the existing manual as well as the new one, obviously, help achieve all of this? For me, the two sort of key things are the hierarchy, which is in the original manual, the idea of considering the needs of pedestrians and cyclists first, then public transport users down to private motor traffic. The diagram there is the draft from the updated version. It's the same concept. You can see we've expanded some of the images within the categories and included zero emission vehicles there. Electric vehicles weren't really a thing in 2007. So this is, considering those needs first, is absolutely sort of the people first streets. The holistic approach is where you want to be starting, and also this idea of designing streets outside in. This is a bit newer for the manual. The idea, traditionally, I think we've designed from the inside out. So we've done 3.65 metre wide running lanes for the cars, and everyone else gets the space that's left over. And if we're starting to move towards thinking about designing for the modes that move the most people, then that's not a particularly efficient use of road space. The same square meterage of pavement with 100 people on is going to have, is going to be moving more people than the same square meterage with the number of cars. Buses carry a hell of a lot more people than the same number of cars. So it's trying to move towards this idea of designing from the outside in, and thinking about whose space needs to be prioritised. There is some detailed street design advice within it, obviously on road widths, visibility, design speeds, all those sorts of granular techie details that designers will need. Next slide, please. Thank you. Sarah's discussed this already, so I won't dwell on this, but we know manual for streets works. So where it is used and is used well, then it works. It's frustrating that we haven't managed to see more of that coming through, but that's part of the reason for the update. Next slide, please. And yes, so that's just to now come on to the update and what's going on with that. I know that I can see from the questions in the chat that there's an awful lot of interest in this, and hopefully I can give you a bit of clarity, although possibly not as much as some might like. Why we're updating the manual, given we know it works and it says all this great stuff. Why do we need to update it? Passage of time, 2007 is 16 years ago, so quite a long time. The planning framework has changed hugely. Even the policy transport, the transport policy framework has changed hugely as well. Just in the last 3 years, we've had an awful lot of new policies and strategies come out from government, and all of which has a bearing on how on streets and how they're designed and used. And as has been said, we recognise uptake is not as high as we'd like. And there's lots of reasons for that. Many of which you've discussed amongst yourselves in the chat, I can see. So unfortunately, we are getting these poor development, still very car-centric, still not really delivering what we need. And as I say, there's been a lot of change in other policy areas, excuse me, which MFS can help deliver. We want to make sure that those links are made. And how have we been doing it when we decided to do this? We started this work 3 years ago. It has taken a very, very long time. And I know that's been frustrating. We've partnered with CIHT, Charles Institution of Highways and Transportation, grant funded them to run the project. They've had a very long history of involvement in streets and street design. They were the publishers of Manual for Streets 2, so it was a natural fit to work with them. They appointed WSP as contractors. Next slide, please. And what they did was take the recommendations from the scoping study that we carried out at the department with the Cabinet Office Policy Lab, which was a really useful piece of work to establish that we still needed a manual for streets, which was great to hear from all the feedback we got from the stakeholder events that we held. It should be very clearly branded DFT, MHCLG, as was, but I think basically HM government. It should align with planning policy. It should be freely available and designed with the inputs of users. So that's the sort of basis that we've been working to in updating it. Next slide, please. Excuse me, sorry. So yeah, so those of you looking for detailed sort of trailers of content, I'm afraid there's not going to be, there's not going to be too much of that today. These are some of the sort of what you're going to see is from the draft, is subject to change. It gives you an idea of the thinking behind it. What we're trying to, what we want really is to go to MFS is about outcomes. It's about achieving outcomes. So rather than saying I need a bus lane and a cycle lane and some parking and whatever, what are you trying to achieve holistically with the street as a whole? What do you want that space to be? And then looking at what you provide to achieve those objectives. And setting seven objectives around what streets should be and how they should be designed. Then how you design those to deliver those objectives. And yeah, ultimately, yes, the motherhood and apple pie at the bottom make us happier, healthier, and more productive. It's not a bad thing to aim for. But these are the sort of principles that are emerging that we're drafting the document to. Next slide, please. And again, a little bit more detail on all of these. I won't go into huge amounts of detail talking about this because you will get the slides afterwards. And as I say, it is still in draft. But it's very much about linking to local context. As I've talked about the outcomes-based approach. Dynamic nature of streets, I think that's something that's really coming to the fore, is that existing streets, particularly high streets, town centres and so on, local centres, there is a lot of competition for that space. The nature of streets changes throughout the day. The nature of how you use the space and how we design for that it can be a tricky balancing act. So trying to sort of think about how that's accommodated is one of the things that's part of our thinking. Next slide, please. What's not in it? It's not about prescriptive engineering detail. It is guidance, and I know that there was a question in the chat about the status of it. It is going to remain as good practice guidance. We can't put it on a statutory footing without a lot of complicated, changes to legislation and so on. It will remain as good practice guidance. It will set principles of good street design. There won't be too much detail on emerging technologies like micromobility, and we've got the e-scooter trials underway at the moment in certain parts of the country. This policy on that is evolving. It's evolving quite quickly, but at the same time, there's not quite yet a clear steer on where that's going, so we can't say too much. But it's bearing in mind as a future, there are likely to be future changes on that. We are doing some research with Transport Scotland on inclusive design. There's some research going on around things like continuous footways and bus stop bypasses and so on. Some of that won't quite be ready in time for this. So there won't be there'll be some things that are not quite definitive yet. And it isn't going to be comprehensive and cover rural roads. in the level of detail that perhaps some would wish and that we would like to do. It is going to have primarily an urban and a residential focus. But that said, we've had feedback around urban extensions and making sure that that's how those are joined on, as it were, to the road network is a big feature, I know, for a lot of planning decisions. So that's something that's in our thinking as we go forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. Progress. Where are we now? Yeah, I absolutely, it's taken us a lot longer than we thought to get this done, and I think that's partly because partly because we've had so much change in transport policy. We've had a pandemic which has brought to the fore, in a strange way, the importance of streets and how they can be, how when they're not full of traffic, motor traffic, they can be quite nice places. And there's been so much interest. We're sort of slightly taken aback by that. We've been through engagements with various contributor groups on specific technical areas. We've done some wider stakeholder sessions on the 95% draft. We're now in the process of incorporating all of that, working with Sarah's team, with Rob and his team, to make sure that we get the draft right, that it does what it needs to. And we will be then progressing it towards publication on gov.uk later this year. I'm a civil servant, I can't be more specific than that. But I recognise it's frustrating to have that we keep saying yes, and it feels like it's getting further off to the distance. Just to pick up on something else, dissemination and training is also a very much a part of our thinking, because you can have fantastic guidance. It could even be statutory guidance, but that by itself wouldn't get the change that we need. And I think one of the things we recognise is that we need something more than just putting it out there and launching it and saying this is great. We need to make sure people know about it, that they know how to use it properly, and that it gets embedded properly in people's thinking. So we're also thinking about how that happens, what programs we put together to make sure that both on the planning and the highway side, people are aware of it and know how to use it and are confident in taking it forward into their own work. Next slide, please. And I think one of the things that will help with that, actually, and we're still bottoming this out with them, is the work of Active Travel England, because they are very keen on manual streets, which is nice to hear, and are going to be picking it up as part of its part of their toolkits and using it alongside Local Transport Note 120 on cycle infrastructure design when they're sort of carrying out their functions around reviewing schemes, assessing schemes, helping local authorities build better walking and cycling infrastructure. So I think that will bring it to the fore of a lot of people's thinking if they know that this is something they're going to be assessed on. I think particularly for walking, there isn't an equivalent. MFS is basically the equivalent, I think, of LTN 120 for walking. We don't have a walking LTN, but I think Manual for Streets gets us a lot of the way there to being that guidance that can help improve the status of pedestrian infrastructure. And ATE will also be a statutory consultee on major planning applications, so they'll bring that focus as well when they're looking at proposed schemes. So I think they can be a useful ally in helping improve the standards of what's out there. And I think that is all from me. So I will hand back to Rob for concluding points. Thank you very much.
Yep, that's me. And thanks, Sally. That was really, really informative. And I think this whole session shows how important the document is and the potential it has to affecting change. I mean, what I did mean to say right at the beginning is that when I was practicing planning in a local authority, Manual for Streets was one of my favourite design documents. I used it liberally. So hopefully with the MFS3, the intention is that more people, well, actually everybody uses it routinely. And I think it's not sufficient to say that it should be good practice. It should just be practice. So my concluding points are, I think what's come out of this whole session is that design of the spaces between buildings and the places that we're trying to create is absolutely critical in realising a range of benefits for communities. It's not just about how people move from point A to point B, it's about how people occupy the space that they live in and enjoy it. and have better, healthier outcomes, and allows nature to thrive. I mean, it's not just about moving from point A to point B, it's about being present in the place that you are. I think good design is not very helpful if it's an add-on at the end. In fact, all of the design decisions have gone by the time you get a planning application really on your desk. So good design has to be embedded from the inception of the scheme. It's critical. It's as important as pre-app advice. And the National Design Guidance, the National Model Design Code and Manual for Streets, really valuable tools for you guys, the experts in all of this, to actually affect change at a local level. I think what's really important to say is it forms a very, to my mind, strong guidance and policy framework that extols the benefits and value of good design, and it should be, as I say, routinely applied, and it doesn't have to cost the world. It can be achieved quite easily. But that's my concluding points. But I think there's one more slide, which I think is the next slide, and I think this is just a takeaway for you guys about what your take-home messages are. There's probably a lot more, and some of you have put a lot of interesting stuff in the chat. But one of the things I did sort of want to say, and it's probably not on this slide, but should be, is that when we talk about the key organisations that are here to affect this, and those of you who have been at the Active Travel England one session earlier last week, and another one on the local transport plan guidance, is that you and your organisations are critical in driving this. I said right at the beginning, leadership is one of the things that underpin realising these better outcomes, and that's as much about you guys as it is about the communities that you serve and the organisations that you represent. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for your time. I hope you found it informative, and I think we're moving on to Q&A.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our speakers. I think the key thing that really stayed with me is that if you design good streets, you design good cities. And it shows how important it is for the street is for everyone, from pedestrians to cyclists and to people that drive cars, to kind of have a sense of ownership about the streets in the cities that they live in, and how the streets is kind of very important to people's life outcomes and all. So we'll move on to the question and answer now. Our first question is, the aspiration is that pedestrians' needs are the top of the transportation hierarchy, but so many new housing developments get away with not providing space for pavement. Can Manual for Streets 3 assert that shared space is not used as a thin veil for removing essential pedestrian circulation space, which allows developers to squeeze in more development and prioritizes profit over human-centered design? Sally, are you okay to answer that?
Yeah, I can have a go. I mean, I think, first of all, shared space is a hot topic and has been for a number of years. I think we all recognise that. I think Manual for Streets would definitely be on the side of, is definitely going to be saying, you know, pedestrian needs should not be compromised. And I think what exactly we're going to say about shared space within new development isn't quite formed, but we're certainly moving away from the position that shared space is okay, certainly on existing streets, particularly level surfaces. That's not something that we still have the pause in place on level surfaces at the design stage, because of the difficulties that some groups can experience with navigating that. So I'm just reading the question again to make sure I've understood properly. I think there's a couple of things there. I think there's Equality Act concerns as well. Obviously, if you're thinking about about groups with protected characteristics, particularly disabled people, then you know that's an avenue of, if you're trying to get away with no pavements, then that's not exactly necessarily going to meet the Equality Act obligations. I think certainly Manual for Streets, the updated manual, is going to be, as I alluded to, there's a strong focus on accessibility and inclusive design within it, and making and that would be, you know, that would be part of that, not compromising on pedestrian design. We'll signpost to the updated inclusive mobility as well, which includes our recommended advice on minimum footway widths. So yeah, so there is it's very much in our thinking. I think the question is a good prompt to me to go away and make sure that we address this properly within MFS.
Thank you very much, Sally. One more question for you. What status will Manual for Streets 3 have? Manual for Streets principles on permeable layouts, etc., have been ignored by most house builders since Manual for Streets published.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of said a bit about this in the presentation. It is guidance. We can't change. We're not going to change the status of that. That's a more complicated and far bigger piece of work to be thinking about in relation to legislation and so on. But I come back to the point I made about dissemination and training. It's less about, for me, it's less about the status of the document itself and more about, and as much about making sure people are aware of it, use it properly, incorporate it within their own policies, and really kind of adopt it and are clear about what they expect of people using it. So yeah, we're not changing the status, but we do want to bring it much more in the forefront of people's thinking. And I think, as I say, ATE, Active Travel England, will have a role to play in that as well, especially if they are statutory consultees on major planning applications.
Okay, thank you very much again. And I realized in comments that a lot of people have been talking about the weighing and application of Manual for Streets. Rob, would you like to come in and comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen loads of comments about, you know, the status of Manual for Streets and how it's applied at a local level at decision taking, and I suppose to a certain degree plan making. I think the important thing to sort of draw out of it is that Manual for Streets, yes, it is guidance. I think it's very important to contextualise it within the wider framework of policy and guidance that's out there. That includes the National Planning Policy Framework, which is very clear about design, and the National Design Guide and National Model Design Code. These documents will read over to each other. Equally, I think it's really important not to underestimate the value that Manual for Streets will have in terms of its application through Active Travel England and their function as a statutory consultee in the planning system. They will be using the document liberally, and I think that's really important to state. I think also there is a bit here around capacity and capability training specifically, and how we disseminate the Manual for Streets. I said Manual for Streets, the original 2007 version, was one of my favourite documents. I used it all the time, I will be honest, but not a lot of people know about it. And that there lies some of the problem to a certain degree. So how can you expect something to have an impact when people don't know about it? So I think the dissemination and putting it out there and making sure that people know about it and that it's a resource that people can rely on and use is really important. And I think, like I say, having the advocacy of Active Travel England, having the advocacy of national guidance status, and hopefully in time embedded within the national planning policy framework or later development management policies, will give it sufficient weighting to be taken seriously and have due regard to. But I don't think that, I think that's a bit too passive sometimes. I think it's also about actually using it and using it routinely. And when I said that you guys are critical in all of this, your organisations, your leadership within those organisations is critical, because you have a lot of power to do things differently, to think about how you're writing your design codes, when you're writing your design codes, when you're looking at the standards for your adoptable streets and the design for your streets and your highways. You know, this document should be the go-to document. So I think it's really important that we recognise that this is as much you being active as us making sure that we're disseminating everything that we need to you, give you the capability to use it, but also ensure that we've got a mutually supportive planning policy and guidance framework that pulls in the right direction, because the net benefit, the net result will be betterment across the board.
Thank you very much. Is there any other thing our presenters would like to add from what they've seen in the charts? Go on, John.
Yeah, just to, you know, obviously from what we've seen in the chat, there's a great anticipation of the publication of Manual for Streets 3. to call it that. And, you know, it's a great opportunity to, I think, to bring together some of the progressive thinking about transport and placemaking into one place, and to give strength to the elbow of planners and also, you know, highway and transport planners in local authorities, give them strength to the elbow to try and do things innovatively and creatively to make better places. So, you know, let's hope, I'm sure it will, but let's hope that the document can create that platform for change, really, and all towards better placemaking, which is what Homes England, from our point of view, is what we're trying to deliver.
Thank you very much. Is there any other person that would like to comment? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to our participants, and thank you to our speakers, John, Robert, Sarah, and Sally. Thank you for your time, and thank you to everybody for your contributions. We finished a little bit earlier, so I will give you some time back in your diary. So thank you for your time. Thank you, and have a good day. Bye-bye.